Welcome to Reform Thinking. We are just thrilled you could pull up a chair and join us for this deep dive into the source material today. We have a staggering text to look at, and we are going to look at it through the specific lens of Reformed theology, keeping the Westminster Confession close at hand. The mission for our conversation today is to take a comprehensive look at Psalm 29. We are pulling insights from Mark D. Futato's excellent work, Interpreting the Psalms, and Exegetical Handbook. We want to understand how to properly analyze biblical poetry, figure out how to move from strictly exegeting the original text to actual exposition, and then apply these immense truths about God's sovereignty over creation to your daily life. Okay, let's unpack this. We are looking at a passage of scripture that many people gloss over as just a nice, quaint poem about a thunderstorm. But when you look closely, this text provides a startlingly new way to view the world. It is a bold, aggressive, theological statement about who is actually running the universe.
It truly is. And to grasp the magnitude of that theological statement, we have to look at the methodology first. Before we draw those massive conclusions about sovereignty and creation, we must look at the precise Hebrew structure of the text. The architecture of a given passage often contains as much meaning as the vocabulary itself. When we approach biblical poetry, we're not looking at free verse. We are not looking at a stream of consciousness where the author just wrote down whatever came to mind. We're looking at highly structured, meticulously crafted literature. Futato points out that the first step in getting oriented to Psalm 29 is recognizing its specific mathematical and grammatical symmetry. The text is divided into three distinct strophes, or poetic stanzas. You have verses 1 through 2, verses 3 through 9, and verses 10 through 11.
Okay, I want to pause right there because looking at the math of this poem completely changed how I read it. When you sit down and actually count the words out in the original language, the symmetry is mind-blowing. The opening section, verses 1 and 2, contains 16 Hebrew words. And out of those 16 words, 4 of them are the divine name, Yahweh. Then, if you skip all the way down to the closing section in verses 10 and 11, that section also contains precisely 16 Hebrew words. And again, 4 of those words are the divine name, Yahweh. You have these perfectly matched bookends holding the entire poem together. But I have to ask, because I think you listening might be wondering the same thing, are we sure David did that on purpose, or is that just a coincidence of how the language worked out when he wrote it?
That is a brilliant question to ask, and the answer is an emphatic yes. It is entirely on purpose. Ancient Hebrew poets were masters of structure. They didn't have rhyming words the way we do in English poetry. Instead, they used structural symmetry, syllable counting, acrostics, and precise word counts to convey meaning. They constructed their poems like architects construct buildings. The 16-word bookends are load-bearing walls. And the middle section proves this intentionality even further. In verses 3 through 9, you have a sevenfold repetition of the phrase, the voice of the Lord. 7 is the number representing completion or perfection in the Hebrew Bible. By using that phrase 7 times, the author is mathematically declaring that God's voice is absolute, perfect, and completely sovereign. We also see grammatical shifts happening right alongside the math. The opening verses use the imperative mood giving commands to an audience, while the rest of the song shifts into the indicative mood, simply stating facts about reality.
I love that concept of the math acting as load-bearing walls. That brings us to another structural point the source material brings up. There is a distinct shift in the subject of the sentences toward the end, right?
Yes, the subject shift is a massive clue to the meaning. Throughout that turbulent middle section, the grammatical subject of the sentences is the voice of the Lord. The voice breaks the cedars, the voice strikes with flashes of lightning, the voice shakes the desert. But in verse 10, the subject shifts simply to the Lord, Yahweh himself. The 16-word bookends create a structural frame around all that chaotic storm imagery in the middle. He gives the poem a feeling of divine order surrounding chaotic weather. The storm is wild, but it is contained within the structural boundaries set by the author, just as the physical storm is contained within the boundaries set by God. The literary structure mirrors the theological reality.
Connecting this meticulous structure to the Reformed view of the verbal plenary inspiration of Scripture is vital here. But I think we need to define our terms for anyone listening who might not be familiar with that phrase. When we throw around terms like verbal plenary inspiration, someone listening might picture God possessing David like a zombie and forcing his hand to write 16 words here and 16 words there. How do we explain that concept accurately without making it sound like mechanical dictation?
That is a crucial distinction to make. Verbal means the very words themselves are inspired, not just the general ideas. Plenary means all parts of the text are equally inspired. But to your point, it is not mechanical dictation. Think of it like this. God did not dictate the Psalms the way a boss dictates a letter to a secretary, where the secretary's personality is totally irrelevant. Instead, God superintended the process organically. He used David's background as a shepherd, his vocabulary, his specific poetic genius, and his cultural context. Yet God guided that process so thoroughly that the final product, right down to the exact mathematical layout of 16 words, 4 Yahwehs, and the sevenfold repetition, is precisely what God intended to communicate. The Westminster Confession articulates this beautifully by stating that it pleased the Lord to commit his truth wholly into writing. The precision matters because it conveys his absolute order over chaos.
That makes total sense. God uses the human author's skills to produce precisely the divine intended result. And speaking of context, we also need to look at where Psalm 29 sits in the larger book of Psalms. We are looking at the single text, but it doesn't exist in a vacuum. If you read the psalm right before this, Psalm 28, the psalmist is in a state of sheer panic. In the first two verses, he is begging God not to be silent. He says, "If you remain silent, I will be like those who have gone down to the pit." The fear is that God is absent, quiet, distant. For the ancient believer, the pit meant death. God's silence equaled absolute despair.
That surrounding context changes everything about how you hear Psalm 29. If you read Psalm 29 by itself, it is a magnificent poem. But if you read it immediately after Psalm 28, it becomes a thunderous, overwhelming answer to a desperate plea. The psalmist feared God's silence, but in Psalm 29, God is not quiet at all. His voice is heard 7 times, shattering the silence, breaking massive trees, and shaking the wilderness. He is answering the cry with overwhelming force. And then following this massive display, Psalm 30 celebrates God actually answering that cry and saving the psalmist from the pit. You have a triad: the desperate plea for God to speak, the terrifying manifestation of his voice, and the subsequent praise for the salvation that his voice brought.
Okay, so with that crazy math and the emotional context in mind, let's actually look at the opening lines of the poem itself. We have established this overarching architecture, but now we have to ask who specifically David is summoning to speak in these opening verses. The heavenly summons in verses 1 and 2 is a quatrain, a 4-line poetic unit calling for a specific audience to ascribe glory and strength to the Lord. The text says, "Ascribe to the Lord, almighty ones." My brain immediately goes to human kings. Is David telling earthly kings and rulers to bow down? Who is he talking to here?
It is a very natural assumption to think he is addressing earthly kings, especially since David himself was a king. However, the literal Hebrew phrase used for this audience is ben elim, which translates to sons of gods. This takes us out of the earthly realm entirely. Futato points us to cross-references like Psalm 89, verse 6, which uses that identical phrase. In that context, it asks, who among the heavenly beings, the ben elim, is like the Lord? That cross-reference makes it unequivocally clear that these are angels in the heavenly court, not human beings on earth. David is pulling the curtain back on heaven itself. He is giving you a glimpse into the unseen spiritual realm, showing the angelic host receiving a direct command.
That drastically changes the scale of the poem right from the start. We aren't looking at an earthly throne room. We're looking at the control room of the universe. And these angels are commanded to ascribe 2 specific things to Yahweh: glory and strength. Let's look at that first word, glory. What is the original word there? And what kind of glory are we talking about? Because glory is one of those words we use so often in church that it almost loses its weight.
The Hebrew word there is kavod, and understanding it restores all the weight that word deserves. Literally, kavod means heaviness or weightiness. It signifies someone's substantial worth. What's fascinating here is the dual nature of this specific word. It is both visible and royal. It is not an abstract, invisible concept that you just feel in your heart. Think back to Moses on Mount Sinai in Exodus 33. Moses makes a bold request. He asks to see God's glory. He wants to see the kavod. And God responds by passing by him in a visible, physical manifestation while Moses hides in the cleft of the rock. It was a tangible, visible reality.
And we see that same concept carry over into the New Testament, right? It isn't just an Old Testament phenomenon.
Precisely. The Apostle John uses the exact same conceptual framework. In John chapter 1, verse 14, he writes that the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, and we have seen his glory. The incarnation of Jesus Christ is the ultimate visible royal glory of God walking on earth. The angels in Psalm 29 are being commanded to recognize this specific type of visible royal weightiness. They are being called to look at the tangible manifestation of God's majesty.
So they're commanded to ascribe this visible, heavy glory, and they are also commanded to ascribe strength to the Lord. What is the nuance of the original word for strength here?
The word is outs. This specific word signifies a royal might. It is not just physical strength, like someone who can lift a heavy boulder. It is specifically the capacity to conquer forces of chaos. If you look at Psalm 74 and 68, That word owls is used when God is depicted as the divine king who vanquishes the chaotic monsters of the sea and brings salvation to his people. It is martial, military might. Furthermore, the angels are told to worship the Lord in the splendor of his holiness, the Hebrew phrase Kadesh. This points directly to the visible splendor the angels are about to witness in the impending storm.
I think an analogy helps picture what is happening here. Think in a royal court in the ancient world. Imagine all the nobles, the dignitaries, and the high-ranking officials milling about in the throne room. It's noisy, people are talking. Suddenly, a herald steps forward and shouts for absolute silence. He commands everyone to stand at rigid attention because the king is about to enter the room. But the king isn't wearing his comfortable lounging robes. He is wearing his full, heavy military regalia. He is armed for battle. The angels in this psalm are being told to brace themselves. They are bracing for a spectacular, terrifying display of God's martial might as he steps onto the balcony of heaven to command the weather.
That analogy captures the mood perfectly. The tension is palpable. And having set that tense heavenly stage, the text rapidly shifts our focus to the earthly manifestation of this might. We move into the second strophe, verses 3 through 9. This section describes a massive, terrifying cyclonic rainstorm moving from west to east during the fall season. And the geography outlined here is highly specific and deliberate.
Let's track the path of this storm because this is where the text gets incredibly vivid. Where does this massive weather system start?
The storm originates out over the mighty waters, which is the Mediterranean Sea. From there, it moves eastward, making landfall and crossing the coastal mountains. As it crosses, it breaks the massive cedars of Lebanon. It then moves further inland over the anti-Lebanon mountain range, specifically hitting a peak called Sirion, which is Mount Hermon. The text says the storm hits with such concussive force that it makes the mountains skip like calves. Finally, the storm blows past the mountains and terminates in the desert of Kadesh, which is the Syrian steppe, stripping the forest bare as it dies out.
The geographic progression is completely vivid. You can literally track it on a map. But let's look at that starting point, the mighty waters. The Hebrew phrase is me'im rabim. I know from reading the source material that this is more than just a map coordinate. What did the ocean represent to the ancient mind? Because today we think of the ocean as a place to go on vacation, sit on the beach, and relax.
To the ancient Near Eastern mind, the ocean was the absolute opposite of a vacation spot. The raging sea was the ultimate symbol of cosmic chaos, untamed destruction, and death. It was the abyss. Look at Psalm 32 or Psalm 93. The mighty waters represent forces that threaten to overwhelm a well-ordered life. They represent the unknown depths that swallow ships and end lives. When the text says the God of glory thunders over the mighty waters, it is stating that Yahweh exercises absolute dominion over the most terrifying, chaotic elements in the universe. The storm starts by subjugating the symbol of ultimate chaos.
And then it moves over land and hits the cedars of Lebanon. For anyone listening, we need to explain what a cedar of Lebanon was to these people. We think of trees as things we cut down to make paper or build a deck. But a cedar of Lebanon was the skyscraper of the ancient Near East. These things grew up to 120 feet tall. Their trunks were massive. They were considered the most robust, indestructible objects in the natural world. Solomon used them to build the temple because they were so majestic and firm. So when the text says the voice of the Lord breaks the cedars, and not just breaks them but snaps them into pieces, it is saying that the most immovable, permanent structures you can possibly imagine are like fragile toothpicks under the weight of God's voice.
That is precisely the image. And then it hits the mountains themselves. Mount Hermon is massive, towering over 9,000 feet above sea level. The text says the thunder and lightning strike with such force that this massive geological formation appears to skip like a young calf. The sheer terrifying scale of this storm cannot be overstated.
But wait a second, I am looking at a mental map of Israel right now. David is the king of Israel, his capital is Jerusalem, but this storm, it entirely bypasses Jerusalem. It bypasses Israel completely. It originates in the Mediterranean, hits Lebanon, hits the Syrian steppe. This is all up north. Why is David writing a hymn about weather in another country? Here's where it gets really interesting. I was reading through the notes on this, and David is basically writing a theological diss track, isn't he? He is targeting a specific rival.
He absolutely is. The inclusion of that specific geography is a brilliant theological strike against Canaanite religion. We are looking at an anti-Baal polemic. The geography David describes traces a path right through Phoenicia, Phoenicia was the absolute heartland of Baal worship.
Mm.
Baal was worshipped primarily as the storm god, the rider of the clouds, who supposedly controlled the rain, the lightning, and the fertility of the land.
So David is tracking a massive thunderstorm right over the capital city of the god who supposedly controls thunderstorms.
Yes, David traces this storm directly over Baal's home turf. The text specifically uses the name Sirion. As Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 9 notes, Sirion is the Sidonian or Phoenician name for Mount Hermon. David is deliberately using their local terminology. He is speaking their language. Furthermore, scholars point out that the text likely features an intentional alliteration using the Hebrew letters Beth, Ayin, and lamed the letters that spell the name Baal. David is taking the poetic style, the geographic landmarks, and the imagery of a Canaanite hymn, and he is completely repurposing it to mock Baal. He is asserting that Yahweh, the God of Israel, is the one who actually controls the storm over Phoenicia. Baal is a myth. Yahweh is reality.
So David basically stole Baal's sheet music, crossed out Baal's name, and recorded a cover version about Yahweh. That is incredible. It is an incredibly bold move. The message is undeniable. Yahweh controls the storm, even the storms in your territory. It immediately brings to mind Elijah's mockery of the prophets of Baal in 1 Kings chapter 18 on Mount Carmel.
The parallel to Elijah is perfect. In that narrative, Israel has suffered a massive drought. The prophets of Baal, the supposed storm god, build an altar and scream for hours. They cut themselves, they dance around trying to get Baal to send fire and rain. But Baal is totally impotent. The text famously says that has no response. No one answered, no one paid attention. He cannot bring fire, and he certainly cannot bring the rain they desperately need to survive. Then Elijah steps up, prays a simple prayer to Yahweh, and Yahweh instantly sends fire from heaven to consume the sacrifice, which is rapidly followed by a massive deluge of rain. Psalm 29 is doing poetically what Elijah did historically. It is a public humiliation of a false deity.
And looking at this through a Reformed lens, this completely highlights the Westminster Confession's teaching on God's absolute providence. God's dominion extends over all creation, even the weather systems hanging over rival nations. The Reformed perspective insists that there are no rogue molecules in the universe. There are no chaotic storms operating outside his sovereign decree. If a massive cyclonic storm hits the Mediterranean, rolls over Lebanon, snaps the cedars, and dies in the Syrian desert, it is because Yahweh specifically ordained its exact path, its duration, and its intensity. Baal has no jurisdiction because Baal does not exist. Yahweh's jurisdiction is total.
That sovereign total decree brings us to the aftermath of the storm in the final strophe, verses 10 and 11. The storm has passed, the winds have died down, and the text concludes with glorious affirmations about the Lord's reign over all things. Verse 10 states, "The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord is enthroned as king forever." The Hebrew word used for flood here is mabel. This is a highly significant vocabulary choice that we cannot gloss over.
Why is that specific word so central? Does it refer back to the mighty waters from the beginning of the storm?
It connects to the concept of chaotic waters, but it is far more specific. The word Mabel is used elsewhere in the entire Hebrew Bible only to describe one event, the Great Flood, in Genesis chapters 6 through 9. It is a technical term for the deluge that wiped out the earth. It represents the chaotic, unformed waters of Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, breaking loose and uncreating the world. For the psalmist to say that Yahweh sits enthroned over the Mabel is to prove that God has permanently vanquished the primordial forces that threaten a well-ordered life. The thunderstorm we just witnessed in verses 3 through 9 is fierce, but it is just a localized, temporary reminder of his universal, eternal kingship over all chaos. He sits on a throne positioned directly above the most destructive force the earth has ever known.
That brings an incredible sense of stability after the chaos of the middle verses. The storm rages, but God is seated. He isn't pacing the floors of heaven worrying about the weather. He is enthroned. And notice the massive shift in the audience here. Verses 1 and 2 summon the angels in heaven to watch the storm and ascribe strength to God. But when we get to verse 11, the focus snaps directly down to humans living on earth. The text says, "The Lord gives strength to his people. The Lord blesses his people with peace."
The word connection there is beautiful. The exact same word for strength oaths that the angels were commanded to ascribe to God when they saw the terrifying, cedar-snapping storm is now given directly to God's people. God possesses this infinite martial might, but he does not hoard it. He dispenses it to his people. And the ultimate blessing he grants is shalom, which is translated as peace.
Let's unpack shalom for a second, because just like glory, peace is a word we overuse. We tend to think of peace as just the absence of conflict, like sitting in a quiet room with a cup of coffee. But shalom means so much more than that, doesn't it?
It means complete well-being, wholeness, prosperity, and human flourishing in every dimension, physically, relationally and spiritually. You have to think about what this meant for an ancient agrarian society. They depended entirely on the weather to survive. If it didn't rain, their crops died and their children starved. The terrifying fall rainstorm described in this psalm was precisely what brought the shalom of a good harvest. The scary, chaotic storm brought the life-giving water necessary for survival. The instrument of terror was also the instrument of blessing.
So what does this all mean for you? If you were listening to this on your commute or while you were working out, how does this ancient poem about a storm over Lebanon apply to your life today? It means the same omnipotence that snaps giant cedar trees like toothpicks, the same dominion that rules over the cosmic flood, is the exact same might graciously handed to you to face your daily trials. The strength that commands the storm is the strength given to you to endure the diagnosis, the financial crisis, the broken relationship, or whatever storm you are currently facing. God is not distant from your chaos. He is enthroned above it, and he is dispensing his strength to you.
Recognizing that reality requires us to take a deliberate step. We have to move from the text to life. Reading and exegeting the Hebrew text, tracking the math, and analyzing the ancient geography is only the first step. Now we must synthesize this into practical exposition. Mark T. Futato provides a highly useful framework for applying the Psalms. He breaks it down into what to believe, what to feel, and what to do. If we truly grasp Psalm 29, it should alter our beliefs, our emotions, and our actions.
Let's walk through that framework, starting with belief. What must we believe based on this text?
First, what must we believe? We must act as biblical theists, not naturalists or materialists. When a massive storm rolls in, the naturalist sees only raw data. They know the scientific realities, and those realities are staggering. A single lightning strike can be 6 miles long, it burns at 50,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which is hotter than the surface of the sun, and it carries anywhere from 100 million to 1 billion volts of electricity. They know that thunder is simply a shock wave created by that rapidly heated air expanding explosively. All of that data is factually accurate. The math and the physics are real. Yet the biblical worldview states that while these scientific mechanisms are happening, this event is concurrently the voice of the Lord. The mechanism does not negate the maker. The physics are simply the tools in the hands of the king.
That is a massive paradigm shift. We have been thoroughly conditioned by modern culture to strip the divine out of the physical world. If you want to know what the weather is doing, you pull up an app on your phone, look at the radar, and you see the green and red blobs moving across the screen. You think you fully understand what is happening because a meteorologist explained that a cold front is hitting a warm front. You think, I know the science, therefore God isn't involved. But a biblical theist looks at that exact same radar, acknowledges the cold and warm fronts, and sees the sovereign hand of God choreographing those fronts. As Paul writes in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, God's invisible qualities, his eternal might and divine nature are clearly seen and understood from what has been made. Creation is constantly preaching a sermon about the Creator. That is what we are called to believe. The world is not a cold, dead machine. It is a theater of God's glory.
That leads directly to the second part of Futato's framework. What are we called to feel? The text aims to evoke a deep sense of awe. Think of a small child sitting in their living room when a massive thunderstorm hits. A huge clap of thunder shakes the entire house. The windows rattle, the lights flicker. What does the child do? They run and grab their parent's leg. That fear is a natural biological recognition of an overwhelming, uncontrollable force. Psalm 29 wants us to take that childhood awe, that realization of our own smallness, and direct it properly toward the creator of the storm. It isn't just about being scared of the noise. It is about reverencing the one who makes the noise. It also intends to evoke anticipation.
Anticipation for what?
Anticipation for God to show up in the messy, chaotic realities of your daily life. Just as the ancient Israelites eagerly anticipated the terrifying fall rains because they knew those rains would bring life to their crops, we should anticipate God working through the chaotic storms of our lives to bring out our ultimate good. We wait for him to bring shalom out of the storm.
That is a beautiful way to look at the trials we face. We believe he is sovereign, we feel awe at his might, and we anticipate his goodness. So what is the final step? What are we called to do?
The action we are called to take, the what to do, is to actively worship the sovereign Lord. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see a stark contrast between ancient Baalism and modern materialism. In our modern context, you and I aren't tempted to carve a statue of Baal out of wood and bow down to it in our backyard during a thunderstorm. That ancient temptation is gone. But we are highly tempted by a new idol materialism. We are tempted to view the storm as a purely meteorological event, completely devoid of divine orchestration. Both of these errors, Baalism and materialism, rob God of his rightful glory. Ancient Baalism attributed God's glory to a false idol. Modern materialism attributes God's glory to blind, mechanistic chance. We must aggressively reject both. We are commanded to look at the physical world, recognize the sovereign hand behind it, and consciously ascribe the glory back to Yahweh. We must speak his praise.
Grounding this fully in Reformed theology, we know that the ultimate display of God's might is not actually found in the weather. The thunderstorm is a signpost, but it is not the destination. The true display of God's might to conquer chaos is found in the person and work of Jesus Christ. If you want to see the force that guarantees your shalom, you don't look at the sky. You look at the cross and the empty tomb. Look at Paul's words in Ephesians chapter 1, verses 18 through 21. He prays that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened to know his incomparably great power for us who believe. Paul says that might is the exact same mighty strength God exerted when he raised Christ from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly realms, far above all rule and authority.
That connection to Christ's work is the absolute bedrock of our peace. In Reformed theology, we talk about the active and passive obedience of Christ. Christ lived a perfect life of righteousness. He perfectly obeyed the law that we broke. That is his active obedience, which is graciously imputed or credited to us. Then he died a substitutionary death on the cross. He willingly stood in our place, absorbing the chaotic wrath and judgment of God that we deserved for our sin. That is his passive obedience. And finally, he was resurrected in total victory over death itself. That finished, complete work of Christ is the absolute guarantee of the peace mentioned in verse 11 of our psalm. The storm of God's wrath hit Christ on the cross so that we could receive the shalom of God's grace.
Think about a time you felt incredibly small. Maybe you were standing on the edge of a cliff, looking out at a raging, massive ocean. Or maybe you were caught outside during a violent electrical storm, feeling the wind try to knock you over. The sheer force of nature in those moments makes you acutely realize your own fragility. You realize you are dust. Frame that feeling not as a mere biological fear of nature, but as a proper theological recognition of your Creator's dominion. Let that feeling of smallness drive you to the cross, where the king of the storm, the one who sits enthroned over the flood, became a servant to secure your peace. The God who breaks the cedars is the God who is broken for you.
Wow. To summarize the progression of our discussion today, we have traveled quite a distance. We started by looking at the precise mathematical structure of an ancient Hebrew poem, noting the 16-word symmetry that brackets the chaos of the storm. We then listened to a heavenly summons, pulling back the curtain on the unseen realm, where angels are commanded to brace themselves for the visible, heavy glory of God. We tracked a chaotic, terrifying cyclonic storm moving from the Mediterranean right over the heartland of Phoenicia, functioning as a brilliant theological strike against the false Canaanite god Baal. We saw David essentially mock the idol by demonstrating Yahweh's absolute jurisdiction over the weather. Finally, we arrived at the quiet, unshakable assurance of God's sovereign peace, given directly to believers on earth, guaranteed by the finished work of Christ. But before we finish, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We talked extensively about how the Ben Elim, the angels in the heavenly temple, cry glory when they witness the immense physical might of a thunderstorm snapping giant trees. But consider this: if physical weather causes the hosts of heaven to shout in absolute awe, what must be their reaction in the heavenly courts when they witness the quiet, unseen miracle of the human heart trusting in God's sovereign providence during the chaotic storms of daily life? If lightning causes them to shout, what does a sinner trusting in grace cause them to do?
That is a staggering thought to dwell on as you go about your week. The quiet trust of a believer is a greater miracle than a thunderstorm. Thank you so much for joining us and letting us share this conversation with you. We always appreciate you making time to dig into the text with us here on Reformed Thinking. Until next time, keep looking at the text and keep looking to the King.